Chers auditeurs,
Dear listeners,
bonjour.
welcome to Comme d'Archi Podcast Season 7.
Saison 7, dans le monde fascinant des architectes.
And in the architectural projects.
Je suis Anne-Charlotte Deponte, passionnée d'architecture et docteur des universités en histoire de l'archi.
I am one of the spokespersons of Anne-Charlotte, who is a PhD in architecture history.
Merci.
Thank you
D'être avec moi aujourd'hui.
to be with us today.
Et
And
maintenant,
now,
lundi en français, place au talent.
and Wednesday, let's talk projects. In English, of course.
Bienvenue dans Comme d'Archi.
Dear listeners, hello, welcome to this new spot episode of Comme d'Archi. Today we are going to talk about time and architecture. Time may be the most silent material in architecture, and yet it is everywhere. I'm not generalizing, but time is in the stone that erodes, in the wood that weathers, in the concrete that ages, in the light that glides across a facade through the seasons, in the uses that gradually transform places, in the successive looks generations give to the buildings they inherit, whether they love or contest them. Architecture is essentially presented as an art of space. It is just as much an art of time. Does a building exist in the instant? It is always caught in a duration between the moment it is imagined and when it is inhabited. Several years can pass. Then come the decades, the transformations, the repairs, the changes in owners, in functions, and in values. Some buildings disappear quickly, others span across centuries, yet all maintain an intimate relationship with time. Perhaps that is why architecture moves us so much, because it confronts us with a reality that we often prefer to forget. We pass through while places remain. They testify to past lives and tell us where we come from. The Basilica of Saint-Denis recounts 8 centuries of transformation, of reinterpretation. It has returned to us the remains of the sovereigns it once sheltered. Stone and the symbolism of flesh. Alois Riegel, an Austrian art historian, wrote, "A monument is a work created to keep forever present and alive in the consciousness of future generations, the memory of an action or a destiny." End of quote. On the scale of a human life, a house seems stable. On the scale of a city, it becomes an episode. On the scale of history, it is sometimes just a parenthesis. Architectural time thus invites us to constantly change scale. Today, this question of time returns with a particular intensity, doesn't it? Environmental concerns, climate issues, questions about resources, the loss of natural land to development, have profoundly changed our view of the act of building, probably also fragmenting generations wrongly. For a long time, building was associated with the idea of progress. Building meant improving living conditions, meeting new needs, accompanying the development of societies. The construction site embodied the future. This vision has not disappeared, but it has become more complex. Building today is no longer just producing a building. It's also extracting resources, consuming energy, transforming a territory, initiating consequences that will far outlast our own existence. My numerous interviews with architects for almost a decade testify to this vibrantly. The awareness of time has considerably expanded. We are now invited to think of multiple temporalities simultaneously, that of the project, that of the climate, that of resources, that of future generations. This evolution is often driven by the youngest among us, whose environmental commitment is real and deserves all our attention. But it would be too simple to make it an opposition between the young and the old, between those who have understood and those who haven't yet understood. History is rarely that simple. Each generation inherits a world it did not entirely choose. Every generation tries to respond to the challenges of its time with the tools it has. Every generation also makes its own mistakes. Architecture constantly reminds us of this. The cities we inhabit are made of successive layers, the famous strata. They tell the story of the ambitions, the successes, the failures, the fears, and the hopes of those who came before us. Do you think there has ever been an era that was entirely right? Of course not. No era was entirely wrong. Cathedrals transformed the landscapes, fortifications reshaped the territories. The major public works of the 19th century revolutionized our cities. Modern housing developments have addressed significant social emergencies. Contemporary rehabilitations sometimes correct past excesses while bringing new questions to light. Architectural time teaches us a form of modesty, because what we consider a given today might be called into question tomorrow. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur once wrote that architecture is to space what narrative is to time. This phrasing is worth taking some time over. A building always tells a story, not just its architects, not just its clients, but that of everyone who passed through it, transformed it, occupied it, or simply looked at it. Architecture is a constructed memory. When the architect delivers their work, that is probably where everything begins, for better or for worse. This memory isn't static, it evolves. It is constantly rewritten. We think of former industrial sites transformed into cultural venues, for example, the Tate Modern, of train stations transformed into museums, for example, Orsay, of industrial buildings converted into housing, for example, the lofts of Soho, of wastelands finding a new life, Belle de Mai, in Marseille. Let's also think of those buildings that were long criticized and become, a few decades later, recognized heritage. The Eiffel Tower, the Villa Savoy, the Hall de Baltar, the Unité de Habitation in Marseille, and so on and so forth. Time has a way of revealing things. It cools down passions, adds nuance to judgments, and reintroduces complexity where news often prefers black and white positions, because our era is tempted by radicalism. Debates become polarized quickly. Certainties are asserted vigorously. Social networks accelerate this dynamic even further. Faced with this acceleration, architecture offers another lesson, it seems to me. It reminds us that profound transformations require time. A tree takes several decades to reach its maturity. A city transforms over several generations. A neighborhood finds its balance through its use. Heritage takes time to emerge. The long term doesn't solve everything, but it often helps us understand better. Perhaps this is one of the responsibilities of architecture today, to reintroduce duration into a world fascinated by immediacy. Reintroducing duration also means investing in what will produce its effects tomorrow and not in what pays off immediately today. What scares me today is that the architect must really fight against opposing, diverse, and powerful forces. And if they are made to disappear, as some would wish, precisely those who tend to invest too much in the short term, it would be a disaster. A word to the wise: we must reintroduce duration, not to systematically slow down, not to oppose change, but to anchor change within a continuity. The architect is not just the one who imagines a future. They are also the one who dialogues with the past and engages the present. This position is demanding. It requires holding together realities that are sometimes contradictory, preserving and transforming, building and conserving resources, innovating and transmitting. It also implies accepting uncertainty, because no one knows exactly, for example, what the expectations of the inhabitants will be in 50 years. No one knows how our lifestyles will truly evolve. No one knows what resources will be available or what constraints will emerge. Humility is therefore not a renunciation. It is a method. Perhaps humility lies in recognizing that we are always building for people we will never know. Architects bear this unique burden. They design places that will sometimes continue to live on long after them. Their buildings will welcome other generations, other uses, other imaginaries. That is why architecture cannot be reduced to a technical, economic, or purely environmental response. It requires a long-term vision. A vision of time that goes beyond political cycles, aesthetic trends, and media urgencies. Some people today see everything through the lens of ecology, but that is not possible. It is fundamental, but it is not possible to dismiss the rest. A vision of time that actually connects generations rather than pitting them against one another, because deep down, the questions we are asking ourselves today are not entirely new. How to inhabit the world without exhausting it. How to pass things on without freezing them, how to transform without erasing, how to build without forgetting. These questions have spanned human history in different forms. They remind us that we belong to the same chain of transmission, and perhaps this is one of architecture's most beautiful lessons. Buildings will often outlive us all. Sometimes ideas do too. But what remains above all is the shared responsibility to answer for the world we inhabit together. The time of architecture is not one of permanent urgency. It is one of continuity. It is one of dialogue between generations. It is one of patience. And in an era crossed by so much uncertainty, this patience is not a weakness. It is perhaps a form of wisdom. In any case, that is just my point of view. My concern in the past or upon completing my studies was really to reconcile the heritage perspective with a contemporary design approach, the future. So reconciling the past and the future while securing the present. Even when I got my PhD in architectural history, I always made a point of working in an agency. I carved out a place for myself not as an architect, but as a communicator, because, as a historian, I could have an observer's position. And also because, at the time, heritage people and architecture in the making and contemporaneity were somehow a bit fragmented, opposed. You could feel it in symposiums. I went to symposiums all over the place, and you could feel that, and it seemed impossible to me. I think today that's not even the subject anymore. The challenge today is to raise our sights, and unfortunately, we are far from it. We need to bring responsibility back into the conversation. We need to bring culture, critical thinking, and reading back into our lives. I could have easily failed given my background. Just listen to myself. because I took a lot of hits personally, but architecture somehow guided me. There you go. But we still have a lot to offer each other still. We have to move forward, and we must continue to live, to marvel, and perhaps return to beauty. Dear listeners, thank you for listening. See you next week for new adventures. Until then, take care of yourselves. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to tune in to our previous content on Instagram at Comme d'Archi Podcast. If you like it, make sure to promote the podcast by giving it 5 stars on Apple Podcast and adding a comment, or on any of your favorite podcast platforms. And don't forget to subscribe and listen to all of our episodes for free. See you soon, and until then, take care of yourself.